The year was 1944, and the Pacific theater of World War II had become a grinding nightmare of blood, heat, and endless violence. On a godforsaken stretch of coral and jungle known as Peleliu Island, the United States Marine Corps faced one of the most brutal battles in military history. Among the thousands of young men thrown into this meat grinder were 30 Black Marines, members of the 11th Marine Depot Company and 7th Marine Ammunition Company, men who had been relegated to the back lines, to the unglamorous work of loading supplies, digging latrines, and hauling ammunition. Private First Class James Bailey stood knee-deep in muddy water, his dark skin glistening with sweat under the merciless tropical sun. At 22 years old, he had enlisted with dreams of proving himself, of showing that Black men could fight just as fiercely as anyone else for their country. Instead, he found himself unloading crates of artillery shells while the white Marines got all the glory on the front lines. "It is insulting," muttered Corporal Eugene Dent, a wiry man from Detroit with sharp eyes and quick hands. "We train just as hard. We bleed the same, but they treat us like pack mules." Bailey said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He had grown up in rural Georgia, where segregation was not just law but a way of life. He had seen his father bow his head to white men who were half as smart and twice as cruel. When the recruiter came through town in 1943, Bailey signed up the same day. He thought the military might be different. He thought wrong. The other Marines in their unit felt the same quiet fury. There was Sergeant Thomas McFadder, a former steelworker from Pennsylvania who could outshoot most of the white boys in target practice. There was Private Leon Burns, a boxer from Chicago with fists like hammers and a heart that refused to quit. 30 men in total, all Black, all hungry to prove their worth in a nation that refused to see them as equals. The battle for Peleliu had been raging for 5 days when the unthinkable happened. The Japanese forces, numbering over 15,000 battle-hardened soldiers, had dug themselves into an elaborate network of caves and fortified bunkers across the island's ridges. American casualties were staggering. The 1st Marine Division was being chewed to pieces. Then came the morning of September 20th. Bailey and his unit were hauling ammunition up a muddy trail when the sound of gunfire suddenly intensified. Explosions rocked the earth. Through the smoke and screaming, a young lieutenant came sprinting down the path, his face white with terror. "Fall back! Fall back! The Japanese have broken through. They are overrunning the line." Chaos erupted. Marines scattered in every direction. The lieutenant looked at Bailey and the other Black Marines with wild eyes. "You men, grab weapons and hold this position. Do not let them through." And just like that, he was gone, running toward the rear with a dozen other white Marines in tow. Bailey stood frozen for a moment, his mind trying to process what had just happened. They had been abandoned, left behind to face an overwhelming enemy force with nothing but rifles, a few machine guns, and their own guts. Dent looked at Bailey. "What do we do?" Before Bailey could answer, McFadder stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "We do what we came here to do. We fight." The 30 Black Marines quickly formed a defensive perimeter on a narrow ridge overlooking a jungle valley. Below them, they could see movement, hundreds, no, thousands of Japanese soldiers advancing through the trees, their rifles glinting in the dappled sunlight. Burns checked his ammunition. "This is suicide, man. 30 of us against all that?" McFadder loaded his weapon with deliberate precision. "Then we make it count." Bailey felt something shift inside him. All his life he had been told he was less than. Too Black to sit at the lunch counter. Too Black to vote without a test. Too Black to be trusted with a rifle on the front lines. But here, on this godforsaken island, with death marching toward them through the jungle, none of that mattered. Here they were Marines. Here they would stand. The first wave of Japanese soldiers emerged from the treeline like a flood. The sound of their battle cries sent chills down Bailey's spine. He raised his rifle, his hands steady despite the fear hammering in his chest. "Hold your fire," McFadder commanded. "Wait for my signal." The enemy came closer. 50 yards. 40. 30. "Now! Fire!" The ridge exploded with gunfire. Bailey squeezed his trigger again and again, watching Japanese soldiers fall. Beside him, Burns manned a machine gun, sweeping it back and forth in controlled bursts. Dent threw grenades down the slope, each explosion sending bodies flying. The battle had begun, and there was no turning back. The Japanese kept coming in waves that seemed endless. For every soldier that fell, 2 more appeared from the jungle shadows. Bailey's rifle barrel grew hot against his palms as he fired round after round into the advancing mass. The air became thick with smoke and the metallic smell of blood. "We cannot hold them much longer," Burns shouted over the deafening gunfire, his machine gun rattling without pause. McFadder remained eerily calm, moving along the line and directing fire. "Conserve your ammunition. Make every shot count. We hold this ridge or we die trying." Hours passed like an eternity. The sun climbed higher, turning the ridge into a furnace. Sweat poured down Bailey's face, mixing with dirt and gunpowder residue. His shoulders ached from the rifle's recoil. His ears rang from the constant explosions. But he kept firing. By midday, 3 of their men were dead. 5 more were wounded, including Dent, who took shrapnel to his leg but refused to stop fighting. He tied a belt around his thigh and kept throwing grenades, his face twisted in pain and determination. The Japanese changed tactics. Instead of frontal assaults, they began flanking maneuvers, trying to climb the ridge from multiple angles. Bailey found himself spinning between targets, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. "On your left," McFadder screamed. Bailey turned just in time to see a Japanese soldier charging at him with a bayonet. He fired point blank, the man's body crumpling at his feet. Bailey stared down at the dead soldier's face, seeing for the first time that his enemy was just a young man, probably no older than himself. The thought vanished as quickly as it came. There was no time for reflection, no time for humanity, only survival. The afternoon brought a brief lull in the fighting. The Japanese pulled back to regroup, leaving the ridge littered with bodies. Bailey slumped against a sandbag, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Around him, his brothers in arms looked like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their uniforms soaked in blood and sweat. Burns sat beside him, his voice barely a whisper. "They left us here to die, man. Those white boys ran and left us to die." But Vincent still had something the government didn't expect: connections. Even in prison, even under constant surveillance, he maintained contact with soldiers who owed him their lives. He began to piece together what had really happened. The 8,000 Nazis hadn't just been dismantled. They'd been absorbed. The intelligence agencies had taken the most valuable Nazi operatives and integrated them into their own organizations. Operation Paperclip, they called it later, though officially it wouldn't begin for 2 more years. What the 15 mafia bosses had uncovered was a conspiracy so vast that the government had to erase them to keep it hidden. They had done their job too well. They'd torn down the Nazi network, but in doing so, they'd exposed the rot at the heart of American power itself. Vincent sat in his cell, knowing the truth but powerless to share it. He had served his country, and his country had betrayed him. The turning point came in 1945, when a young journalist named Margaret Chun received an anonymous package at her newspaper office in New York. Inside were documents, classified files, internal memos, photographs of meetings that should never have happened. The package included a name, Vincent DeLuca, and a message written in careful handwriting. "He knows the truth. He's in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. He's been silenced." Margaret had built her career on exposing corruption, but nothing had prepared her for this. The documents detailed everything: the Nazi cells, Operation Underworld, the government conspiracy, the cover-up. She read late into the night, cross-referencing names, checking dates, verifying sources. Every piece fit together like a puzzle designed to destroy everything America believed about itself. When she visited Vincent in prison 2 weeks later, she brought a camera hidden in her purse and a determination that terrified the guards. Vincent was thin, broken by years of isolation and psychological torture. But when he saw her, something shifted in his eyes. For the first time in years, someone wanted to hear his story. Someone believed him. Over 3 clandestine visits, Margaret recorded Vincent's entire account. He detailed every Nazi cell they'd infiltrated, every operation they'd run, every piece of evidence the government had stolen. He named the officials involved in the cover-up, the military officers who'd collaborated with Nazi operatives, the intelligence directors who'd chosen to absorb Nazi expertise rather than destroy it. He told her about the other 14 bosses, where they were, what had happened to them, how systematically they were being erased. But Vincent also warned her. He explained that powerful people would do anything to keep this quiet, that her life was now in danger simply for knowing the truth, that she had a choice to make: publish the story and face the consequences, or walk away and live safely in ignorance. Margaret made her choice the moment she walked out of that prison. She spent the next month building her case, contacting every source she could find, every witness willing to speak on record. She found former FBI agents who'd worked on Operation Underworld. She located 3 of the 15 mafia bosses and managed to interview them in secret. She uncovered documents that had been hidden in government archives, classified files that proved everything Vincent had told her. The article was ready. It was explosive, could change everything. But before she could publish, federal agents showed up at her apartment. They didn't arrest her. They didn't need to. They simply told her that publishing the article would be considered a threat to national security. They showed her photographs of her family. They explained very politely what could happen if she went forward. Margaret faced a choice that would define the rest of her life: print the truth and watch her family suffer, or protect them and let the conspiracy remain hidden. If you're feeling the tension building, if you're wondering what Margaret decided and whether Vincent's story will finally be told, you have to stick with us. Hit that subscribe button right now. This is where everything changes. The truth is about to surface, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Margaret made a decision that would reverberate through history. She didn't publish in her newspaper. Instead, she contacted every major news outlet in America simultaneously: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, radio stations, television networks. She gave them all the same package of documents, all the same evidence, all the same story. If they arrested her, they'd have to arrest dozens of journalists. If they silenced one newspaper, 10 others would print the truth. The government couldn't stop what came next. On March 15, 1945, headlines exploded across America. Nazi conspiracy reaches highest levels of U.S. government. Mafia bosses reveal federal cover-up. Operation Underworld, the story they tried to bury. Within hours, Congress demanded an investigation. The American public, already reeling from the final stages of the war in Europe, faced a truth that shattered their faith in their own institutions. But the real climax came 3 days later. Vincent DeLuca was released from prison. Not through a pardon, not through legal channels, through public pressure so immense that the government couldn't hold him without starting a riot. When he walked out of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in the spring sunlight, Margaret was waiting for him with a camera crew. The image of that moment, Vincent stepping into freedom after years of psychological torture, became iconic. A man who had sacrificed everything for his country, finally vindicated. The other 14 mafia bosses were released within weeks. Lucky Luciano was freed and eventually deported to Italy, where he lived out his days as a legendary figure who had served America in its darkest hour. Meyer Lansky was quietly released and allowed to continue his life. Others received commutations, reduced sentences, or complete pardons. The government had no choice. The truth was out, and trying to silence these men would only prove the conspiracy was real. What happened next was the true turning point. Congress launched a full investigation into Operation Underworld and the subsequent cover-up. High-ranking officials were forced to resign. Military officers were court-martialed. Several government conspirators faced treason charges. The scandal rocked America, forcing a national reckoning with the truth that Nazi infiltration had reached the highest levels of power. But perhaps most significantly, the 15 mafia bosses became unexpected heroes. They weren't glamorized or celebrated in the traditional sense. They were still criminals, after all. But they were recognized for what they had actually done. Saved their country from an existential threat that nobody else could have stopped. They proved that sometimes the only way to fight monsters is to use other monsters who understand their world. Vincent spent his final years writing a memoir, a detailed account of Operation Underworld that became required reading in military academies across America. He died in 1968, respected not as a criminal, but as a patriot who had made an impossible choice and paid an extraordinary price for it. Bailey sat cleaning his rifle when a full colonel approached, flanked by 2 captains. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Mitchell was a legendary figure, a veteran of Guadalcanal known for his no-nonsense approach and iron discipline. Sergeant McFadder, front and center, the colonel barked. McFadder stood, his body still bearing the cuts and bruises of battle. "Yes, sir." The colonel looked at him for a long moment, then at the other black Marines gathered nearby. "I have been in this man's Marine Corps for 22 years. I have seen acts of courage that would make your blood freeze. But what you men did on that ridge, holding against 15,000 enemy soldiers with just 30 rifles, that is something I will remember until the day I die." He paused, and Bailey saw something he never expected to see. The colonel's eyes were moist. "You were called crazy, expendable, left behind to die, and you turned that abandonment into the most heroic stand in this entire campaign. You did not just hold a position. You saved this entire division from being overrun." McFadder stood straighter. "We did our duty, sir. Nothing more." The colonel shook his head firmly. "You did far more than duty, Sergeant. You changed minds. You broke down walls that have stood for generations. Every man in this division now knows that courage has no color." Over the following weeks, the Black Marines were no longer segregated to supply duties. They fought on the front lines, respected and valued. Bailey found himself leading mixed patrols, his tactical decisions trusted without question. Burns became a combat instructor, teaching hand-to-hand fighting techniques to new recruits. Dent, despite his injuries, refused evacuation and continued fighting until Peleliu was finally secured in late November. The battle cost the Marines dearly, over 10,000 casualties. But the ridge held by the 30 Black Marines became a symbol of something greater than military victory. It became proof that the old ways, the segregated ways, were not just immoral but tactically foolish. When Bailey finally received orders to ship home in early 1945, he stood on the beach where he had first landed months earlier. McFadder stood beside him, both men staring out at the Pacific waves. "We changed something out here," McFadder said quietly. "Maybe not everything, maybe not enough, but something." Bailey nodded. "When we get home, they will still make us sit in the back of the bus. Still make us drink from different fountains." McFadder smiled grimly. "Let them try. We held a ridge against 15,000 enemy soldiers. We can handle whatever they throw at us back home." The war had forged them into something unbreakable, and America would never be quite the same. 20 years later, in the summer of 1964, James Bailey stood in front of a classroom at Howard University in Washington, D.C. His hair had started to gray at the temples, and a slight limp from an old war wound marked his gait. But his eyes still carried that same fire from Peleliu. He was now Professor Bailey, teaching American history to a new generation of young Black students hungry for change. On this particular afternoon, he spoke about the Civil Rights Act that had just been signed into law by President Johnson. "Change does not come easy," he told his students. "It is bought with blood, sweat, and the refusal to accept that things cannot be different." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Professor Bailey, is it true you fought in the war? That you were one of the Marines at Peleliu?" Bailey smiled softly. "I was, and I fought alongside the bravest men I have ever known." What he did not tell them was the full story. How Eugene Dent had become a successful attorney, fighting segregation cases across the South. How Leon Burns had opened a boxing gym in Chicago that trained dozens of Olympic hopefuls, both black and white. How Thomas McFadder had joined the newly desegregated Marine Corps officer program and risen to the rank of major before retiring with honors. And how their stand on that blood-soaked ridge had been documented, studied, and quietly used by military reformers to push for full integration of the armed forces. President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, desegregating the military, had been influenced in part by the undeniable evidence that segregation weakened combat effectiveness. The 30 crazy black Marines had done more than hold a line. They had helped change a nation. That evening, Bailey received a phone call. It was McFadder, now living in Virginia with his grandchildren. "Did you hear?" McFadder asked, his voice excited. "They are finally doing a proper military history book about Polillo. They are including our story. The real story." Bailey felt warmth spread through his chest. "About time, old friend." "We showed them," McFadder said quietly. "We showed them what we were made of." "Yes," Bailey replied. "Yes, we did." As he hung up the phone and looked out his window at the changing America beyond, Bailey thought about that terrifying day in September 1944. About the impossible odds. About the brothers he lost and the ones who survived. About proving that courage knows no color. The Ridge had been their crucible, and they had emerged as legends. If the story moved you, if it reminded you that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to give up, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us what story you would like to hear next. Share this with someone who needs to hear about real courage, real sacrifice, and real change. These stories matter. These heroes deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching until the very end. We will see you in the next one.